So with examples like that out there, it's easy, again, for us to roll our eyes and think, why the heck are we going through this big change if that's all it's going to give us? So I'm going to cover, there's actually quite a few reasons why ICD-10 is important, but I just kind of picked out the top 3 that stood out. The number one reason I would say is for public safety. If you look at even the definition of ICD, International Statistical Classification of Diseases, ICDs were created as a way for us to communicate that across the world where language might be a barrier, the code itself could indicate some of those changes. So this is taken from an article that discusses the rapidly accelerating pace of pathogen discoveries and the risk of new infections and the importance of identifying infectious disease outbreaks early to prevent threats to public health. So if you think back again, if ICD-9 has been around since 1979, and I look at all these little dots and things on this map of discoveries and new infectious diseases that have occurred since 1979, are we limiting ourselves with the code set that we have right now? So new game, you can't diagnose that in ICD-9. One that I think hits home to all of us is the Ebola breakout. So if you look at under ICD-9, which is what we're using today, we can only code that as other specific disease due to viruses, which could be a whole slew of things, right? But the rest of the world under ICD-10 can actually specifically identify through their coding the Ebola virus. So again, our communication with the world and our ability to track these threats to public health and and our ability to respond to that is limited simply by the code set that we're using. So number 2, and I guess these really aren't in any specific order because this one I would say is equally important, and that's patient safety. ICD-9, it's like driving our old Pintos back in the day. It might have been great in that day, but there's a lot better versions available to us now. Like, would we want to go back to one of those cars when we can talk to our cars now, and we can, even on the radio this morning I heard about the car that's being released that can drive without being manned. So would we want to go backwards? ICD-9 as it is really is old and obsolete. We're very limited. There just is no room for new expansion there because of the 5-digit codes and that we've used up the spaces. As new things come, there's nowhere for us to add those in. So ICD-9 is also limited in the specificity in the diagnosis. So we can't capture the same level of detail or risk or severity, and that is actually quite important to better patient care. This is another, Ricardo Martinez shared his experience with ICD-9 on the CMS website, and I think it's important, besides just communicating with the entire world, we do have an ever-increasing need to communicate between physicians. The last 30 years have seen such a great advancement in medicine, and with that advancement has really become a significant increase in the number of specialists. So the result of that is that we need to better collaborate and coordinate between physicians. So simply put, ICD-9 has its limitations in our ability to communicate through the code itself. Dr. Martinez shared a story about how he had a patient with an acute stroke that had a history of a previous stroke, and he had to spend time searching through old records to identify whether the previous stroke was on the left or the right side. And he just pointed out that he was wasting valuable time that he could have been dedicating to treating the patient if that same information had been available to him or been identified in a single ICD-10 code. And his point was simply better data makes better care possible. The third, I'd say top reason is that better data can also equal better reimbursement. So with the granularity in the codes, providers should expect more accurate payment structure over time. So greater claim accuracy, fewer denials and underpayments, fewer bills, inefficiencies in reimbursement processes. So if there's more detail, in other words, sent on the claim to, demonstrate medical necessity of why certain procedures were done or risk or severity, then there should be less request for supporting documentation and things like that. Today, we have a lot of those requests, again, simply because the codes can't be as specific. And again, ability to differentiate reimbursements based on the complexity and outcomes. And Dr. Martina shared, or I'm sorry, Dr. Nichols shared how the code itself can provide much more detail when it comes to severity and risk. And this was an example that he gave of, an open fracture of the femur. Under ICD-10, there's only 16 codes available to code that. But when you're talking about a fracture can have multiple pieces. You could be seeing a patient for an initial encounter. The type of fracture, A through C, would indicate the severity of the fracture, and the severity is very important because he explained that type 1A fracture could be rinsed out and put on antibiotics, and there's really low risk of infection, where a type 3C almost always ends up in amputation. So there's a huge variance in the type of fractures, and that's why it's so important to capture it in the code, because that would indicate the level of risk and severity. And again, that could justify some of the procedures that were done and the reimbursements for treating a patient. So what is the impact of ICD-10?